prophetic scripture and its relation to us today, namely how close we are to the rapture of the church and all of the prophecies that are going to occur in the lead up to that, as well as some prophecies that will occur after that. Right now we're looking in Matthew 24. That's going to be the core scriptures that we pull from. Last time on this podcast, we looked at some of the concerns that a lot of people have with prophecy and its study. We looked at three main concerns that pop up in people's mind. One being fear, the other being confusion, and then the final one, apathy, and how these things block us from pursuing prophecy and how we can overcome them, and so that we can approach prophecy with an open mindset and draw closer to God as a result. Now, earlier on this week, we posted a written examination of prophecy based off of Matthew 24 and 3, how the disciples came to Jesus and had questions for him, and that showed that they had interest and desire to understand prophecy, and they had two specific questions for him. One was a question that related directly to them that they knew would occur in their lifetime, which was the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, and the other is something that may, or that at the time they did not know for sure whether it would occur in their lifetime, and that was the end of the world. And we examined in that devotion or lesson, or however you want to say it, what that showed us was that there were two different types of prophecies that we find throughout the Bible. The first being close prophecy and the second being far prophecy. Now, those are terms that I have coined. I haven't heard anybody else use those two terms. They may have been, but there's probably different variations of those two types of terminology. But basically, close prophecy is prophecy that we have an understanding will most likely occur within our lifetime. And far prophecy is prophecy that either we're not sure will occur in our lifetime or most likely will not occur in our lifetime. We use some Old Testament examples of that. In close prophecy, we used how God told Abraham that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. I think I actually have it, and I'm gonna edit it to make sure that it's not incorrect. Abraham was not told that Nineveh would be destroyed. It was Sodom and Gomorrah. I was using a different example, and unfortunately I forgot to edit that, so I'll go back in and edit that. So if anybody caught that, I apologize. But that was an example of close prophecy that actually occurred within at least a matter of days, if not within 24 hours. We don't know the exact time. I don't know off the top of my head the exact time frame for how long it took from God talking to Abraham to God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. But it did occur in a very short time period. And then in the example of far prophecy, we used how God also talked to Abraham about how his descendants would outnumber the stars. And Abraham knew as soon as God had told him that, it was not likely to happen in his lifetime. He wasn't going to have a limitless amount of children, especially at his age, but he still did the work to prepare his son Isaac to be a good man so that the descendants that came from him would fulfill other prophecies that God had, which included that they'd be a blessing to all nations and that God would continually bless them. And Abraham knew for his seed to be blessed and to be able to be a blessing, that they would have to uphold righteousness, uphold goodness. Doesn't mean that God doesn't rain good things on the just and the unjust. The Bible tells us that. But for them to stay in the favor and the will of God, his descendants were going to have to serve God. And then to go back to close prophecy, Abraham acted with a sense of urgency and preparedness there by pleading with God to spare the city if he could find at least 10 people. He started with, I think it was 100, and then he worked his way down to 10. Um, but basically, in both examples, we find a sense of urgency and a sense of preparedness by the receiver of the prophecy. And that shows us that regardless of whether we're dealing with close prophecy or far prophecy, there are two things that should come when we receive prophecy gladly, and that is urgency and preparedness. So I'm going to go today and look at some, try and talk a little bit more about these types of prophecy, especially in today's time period. I also talked about how the apostles took those prophecies. They were prepared and operated with a sense of urgency, both on the knowledge that the Temple of Jerusalem would be destroyed and that the end of the world was going to come, is if they believed that everything that Christ said was true. And that's one thing that we have to get in our minds too, is that if God says it, it's going to happen. It's a promise from God, and we have to act accordingly, based on those promises. For the disciples, one thing I find interesting is that they didn't shy away from going into the temple, even though they knew it was going to be destroyed. If you go look in the book of Acts, multiple times it shows them going into the temple to pray and to teach Christ to those in the temple. That's a sense of urgency, and to go into a place that you know is doomed based off of what Christ has told you, and even with that knowledge, you still go in there and you still do the work of the Lord. And how we can relate that to today is we know that this world is doomed. We know that there's with iniquity abounding, and with the love of many waxing cold, and with all the sin that's going on, and with all the destruction spiritually that's going on, and in the physical world too, how things are just seem to fall apart. And we'll get into the specifics of those, because there's prophecies that we're going to examine that show how this society, global society, is degrading. That doesn't mean that we go hide in the hills. That doesn't mean that we go close ourselves off from that society. It means that we run headlong into it, the flames of destruction, trying to pull anybody we can out of that destruction. And that's whether we're going by any kind of close prophecy that's been given or any far prophecy that's been given. The far prophecy that we're still operating under today is that the world is going to come to an end. And that's a whole other thing, is that in that far prophecy, the disciples didn't reject the world. They didn't go hide from the world. They went into the seat of power in the modern world, in that classical world right there of Rome, and knowing that they could get thrown in the lions. They knew they could get murdered. They knew that they could get thrown in prison. They knew that they were going to get persecuted going in to places like Rome and Corinth and other secular societies, and yet they still went and brought the gospel to those societies, because even though they knew the world would come to an end, it was on them to try and reach as many people as they could in the world so that they would not be lost and they would not be destroyed as well. So, and that speaks to us today, just as with the close prophecy, is that whether there's a specific thing that is going to fall within our own close society or something far and wide reaching, we have to be willing to galvanize ourselves and get out there and reach as many people as we can, and be the witnesses that God's called us to be, because God doesn't just warn us about upcoming events in our lives. He urges us to act accordingly. And the one thing that God has asked us to all be is witnesses for Him and in the Great Commission. And so with the knowledge of what is to come from a destructive standpoint, we need to be operating with that knowledge, with an urgency and a prepared plan to win as many people as we can. And that's going to require us getting out of our comfort zones. That's going to require us going in and reaching for people that we wouldn't normally reach for. It's going to require us to be everything that Christ has called us to be. And that's not always easy, because getting out of your comfort zone and talking to strangers and going into parts of your community that you would not normally go into, and interacting with people that you wouldn't normally interact with um, in your own daily life, it's difficult, especially in today's society, because there's so many things that allow us to be excluded from society with the modern technology that we have, that um, we don't have to interact with anybody that we don't want to, and with the way our lives are structured with jobs and family and other things, and even church, we don't have to interact with anybody that disagrees with us. We don't have to interact with anybody who thinks differently with us if we don't want to. But that's not what Christ has called us to. He's called us to go and reach people who don't agree with us, people who may hate what we believe in, people who uh, may reject Christ and reject us because we live it and serve Christ. Um, Christ wants us to reach everybody, and it's going to take giving up a free Saturday. It's going to take giving up a free evening. It's going to take, taking our lunch break, and instead of, trying to run some errands and get things done. It's not to say that you can't get your daily life stuff done. It doesn't mean that you can't spend time with your loved ones and your family and your friends. But if I'm not making time for witnessing, if I'm not making time for reaching for people who are outside of the will of God, who are outside of the kingdom of God, then I'm doing a disservice to myself, I'm doing a disservice to God, and I'm just doing a disservice to those people who I could be witnessing to. So we have to have a plan, and we have to have a sense of urgency with us. And so what's our plan? Well, we can look at how the apostles, the disciples who would become apostles, and all of their followers, what was their plan? Their plan was to go and be present amongst as many people as they could at any given time. Is that they were going to do godly things in public. The temple was not just a regular church service; it was a place of daily gathering, and everybody from all walks of Judaism could go into the temple, into certain areas of the temple, and the disciples knew that was a place where they could go and interact with people in a common fashion, and so they went into that temple, and they started just talking to people, and they started talking to people about Jesus Christ. And and then you fast forward to somebody like Philip, who went into Samaria and just started speaking in the public squares and started speaking to people in public venues and talking about who Jesus Christ was. We just have to get out there and start talking about Jesus. That's the plan. That's how we prepare ourselves, is to get as much knowledge and understanding of who Jesus Christ really was and what he is desiring to do for people. If we will get that inside of our minds, inside of our hearts, and take that into the streets, take that into our grocery stores, take that into, if it's available to us, our businesses, take that into social groups that that we have access to. Take it to the parks. Take it to every area of the city that we can. Even going, if you have to, just go walk through your neighborhood and try and talk to your neighbors who have, unfortunately, in this day and time, our neighbors are strangers. 50, 60 years ago, your neighbor was somebody that you always knew. But we have to go make those interactions when we see a neighbor out and about. We need to go try and talk to them and build a relationship with them. Go talk to a barista. Go talk to your server at a restaurant and just strike up a conversation. And it may not be that first conversation leads to Christ, but eventually a conversation should lead you to talking about Jesus Christ. One thing I found is that I like talking to people about is when you meet somebody new, they might ask you what you do. And I'll usually say what I do for a living, but I also say, well, but I also like teaching Bible studies, and I like, interacting with people and finding out what they know about Jesus. And some people that might shut them down right then and there, but others will say, "Oh, that's really nice," and then you kind of start asking them questions and start creating a dialogue with them. And at the very least, they know who you are and where you're coming from. So that's having a plan. Is going into a situation where you're going to talk with somebody with the knowledge that I'm going to bring up Jesus in that situation, and having the knowledge of Jesus before you go into there. And another thing is praying before you go into a business. I try and pray, whether it's going into a gas station, whether it's going into a coffee shop, whether it's going into a restaurant, whether it's going into the grocery store or any public place, is, Lord, if there's somebody in there that I can reach and I can talk to, give me not only the wisdom to find that person and the vision to find that person, but also give me the words and the understanding of how to handle that person and to approach that person and to talk with that person about you. So that's having some prayer. And as far as the urgency that goes, is understanding that we're so close. And through this study that we're going to go through, this Revelation study, we're going to see how close we are to the coming of the Lord. And I can't let, with the knowledge that I have of how close we are to God's rapture of the church and the second coming of the Lord, I can't hold back with an opportunity, every opportunity I've been given, to at least say something about Jesus Christ, at least have an opportunity to talk to somebody about Jesus Christ. The other day I was in a gas station and I ran across a former neighbor of mine, and I was just had a little conversation with her, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, I've been going through a tough time. And I could have said, oh, I'm so sorry, I hope you're doing well. I could even have said, you know what, I'll be praying for you. But right there in that moment, I felt God lead me and say, take hold of her hand and pray right there in the middle of a gas station with other people walking around trying to find their snacks or find their Cokes or whatever. That we started praying, and it wasn't a very boisterous or loud prayer. It was just, Lord Jesus, help her. You see her. She's your child, and touch her life and be with her and whatever she's going through. And give her peace and understanding of how to deal with it. And she was weeping at the end of that. And she thanked me so much for that. And I was able to be that witness to her in that moment. And that's what we can be. A couple months ago, I just called a guy up that used to come to our church, and he kind of got out and everything. And I said, hey, you want to go get some coffee? And we started having some coffee and stuff. And he had heard that I was back in church because I used to not be in church too. And he started asking questions before I could even bring it up. So there's people out there that are hungry, and all we have to do is be available to them. And that was my Saturday. I spent 2 hours with him in a Saturday in a coffee shop that I could have been watching a football game, or I could have been out playing with my kids, or I could have been doing some yard work or something. I probably do need to do some yard work, to be honest with you. But I put myself in that position to give up some free time and make it God time. And that's what that's where we have to be, is to see that there's an urgency, that it's not about me, it's about God. It's not about what I want, it's about what God wants. And when I start doing that, I feel so much better about myself. And God blesses us as a result of that. He's going to bless you if you will prepare and plan to serve Him with the urgency that's required to serve Him, because there are lost and dying souls, and if they die, they might end up in hell. If the rapture takes place, they may miss it. And as long as there's people out there that are in that boat, especially people that I know and I can interact with and I can make a difference for, then I've got to go out there and do it. The whole New Testament is about going forth and reaching people. It's about growing in our relationship with God, but it's also about getting out there and finding people who we can bring to Christ and develop into Christians and disciple into Christians. And so that's what this last lesson really was about, is sparking that urgency and that fire in us, and getting a passion for God. And we can get that passion amplified when we start studying prophecy. So next week we're going to start finally going into some actual prophetic scriptures, and I hope you'll join us. I hope this this brief podcast today has helped to further get your mind wrapped around this idea of how prophecy gives us a sense of urgency, how it helps us plan. One other thing I did want to say before I sign off is there are close prophecies that's going to happen in your life when you start serving God. People will prophesy over you. It happens in our church. Our church has been prophesied over. And when those prophecies start happening, we need to operate with that urgency to see them fulfilled. We don't know when they might be fulfilled, because there's a lot of times where God speaks prophetically, and you kind of have to, He doesn't say exactly when it's going to happen. He may give some things that we can do to get ourselves moving towards their fulfillment. But when we hear a prophecy spoken over our lives individually, over our churches, or over our communities, we need to grab a hold of that and start saying, God, whatever I have to do, get me ready so that I receive that prophetic word, and give me everything I need to know and understand to do my part, and so that I can start planning and start seeing it fulfilled completely. Um, and of course, we always have the far prophecy, which is the coming of the Lord and the rapture of the church, and we've clearly examined that plenty today. But if you've been ever spoken over a prophetic word in your life, I'd love for you to share it in the comments, whether on our website or in our YouTube channel here, in the comments of this video. And I'd love to, because I'd love to read them, and if I think it's applicable, I'll be happy to share them next time in our next podcast. Because I really believe that there's people out there, you've had something prophetic happen in your life, and you need that. You need to be spurred a little bit, maybe, to see it fulfilled. I know that I do, and this study of prophecy has really started to spur things in my life that have been spoken over my life, and I want to see those things fulfilled. I've been prophesied that I'm going to be a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ in a mighty way, and that I'm going to be able to influence people. It's going to be God through me, and I want to see that fulfilled. And studying this prophecy just gets me all amped up about that, and gets me fired up about that, because I can see that close prophecy in my life, and also knowing the far prophecy of that God's coming back. That amplifies up the things that have been prophesied over my life, and it'll do the same for you. So please continue to join us in our podcast and in our regular studies. I can't wait to see you next time. Early next week, we'll have another devotion out. I believe that we're going to be talking about false Christs and false prophets, and examining how those things have happened both over the centuries since Christ, even maybe before Christ, and how they're still happening today, and what we can do with the knowledge of that. But until then, I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. Please leave some comments. Please let me know what you think. Any suggestions or concerns. But until the next time, God bless and keep searching.